I've just been advised I might have done the wrong thing, but it's too late to make amends, so.
The wrong thing.
Ralph Waldo Emerson particularly admired the figure of the poet because, Emerson wrote, the poet provides access to a dwelling from which we have been excluded. In Emerson's allegory, the place from which we have been excluded is our own home. Quote, "The fate of the poor shepherd who, blinded and lost in the snowstorm, perishes in a drift within a few feet of his cottage is an emblem of the state of man. On the brink of the waters of life and truth, we are miserably dying. The inaccessibleness of every thought but that we are in is wonderful. Every thought is a prison, every heaven is also a prison. Therefore, we love the poet. He unlocks our chains and admits us to a new scene." The form of this liberation, Emerson writes, is in particular and inclusive. Quote, "The poet is an inventor who in any form, whether in an ode, an action, in looks, in behavior, has yielded us a new thought," unquote. In the uses of great men, this emancipation in which we are released from the prison of our limitation is called an enlargement. Alternately, great men and women are, quote, "a collyrium to clear our eyes from egotism," unquote. Or to put it in still other terms, these representative men and women, whom I want to call intellectual heroes, are persons who answer questions that I have not the skill to put. They have an intense, overwhelming, even unquenchable curiosity, which is then pressed into the service of specific, unremitting forms of inquiry. Emerson has a theory of how we keep from being in thrall to the excessive influence of these intellectual heroes. In one aspect of the theory, we avert the intellectual suicide of dependence because we see that the genius of these figures is not impounded in their persons, but is delegated or diffused into qualities, ideas, or achievements which they incarnate or initiate, but do not own. I'm less interested in the self-defense part of Emerson's theory than in his unyielding interest in how intellectual heroes enjoin us to escape confinement in given frames of reference, or to return to the plight of Emerson's poor shepherd within a few feet of his cottage door, close but closed out, how they might enable access to a place we might live. It's easiest to think of the enlargement that Emerson associates with a hero in terms of political courage or humanitarian action. For instance, the Burmese human rights campaigner Aung San Suu Kyi, who was chosen to remain under house arrest since 1989, a symbol of protest, rather than abandon the fight for democracy by leaving her country. Or the medical anthropologist and physician Paul Farmer, whose International Health and Justice Organization is transforming healthcare on a global scale. In the face of crisis and intimidation, these larger-than-life figures are, in Emerson's words, not convulsible. That is, they have the ability to confront crisis without being paralyzed by their distress. But there are examples of intellectual courage, ones more immediate to my own experience, that have less to do with an action or a behavior, to recall Emerson's distinctions, than with a thought. In the case of my examples, with a range of thought, Alan Grossman is my example here, a depth of thought, Stanley Cavell is my example here, and a capacity of thought to transgress the limits of its own understanding, William Empson is my example here. Alan Grossman, a literary critic and the author of 11 books of poetry, comes to mind as a monumental figure because of his propensity to think in the most capacious ways possible about difficult problems. You can hear this in the titles of his essays, for instance, Teaching Literature in a Discredited Society, on the false innocence of the humanities when it dissociates politics and civilization, or Holiness, which for Grossman is neither a consolation nor a promise, but rather a problem that establishes the necessity of a certain kind of work. Grossman's own writing has identified topics one barely knew existed. I'm thinking of uncommunicative difficulty in general and Hart Crane's difficult poetry in particular, in which Grossman considers not simply the meaning of certain Crane poems, but more fundamentally, the sufficient conditions for poems to have meaning at all. And I'm thinking of Grossman's The Poetics of Union in Whitman and Lincoln, which asks how two ideals, Lincoln's union of constitutionalism and fairness versus Whitman's union of sociability and happiness, how two ideals result in competitive discourses with respective liabilities that differently compromise persons. All of Grossman's essays examine the way in which the value of the person is in danger of being effaced, and they equally address how poetry specifically reestablishes that value. At other moments, Grossman claims that poetry documents a catastrophic loss of orientation, and its representation of that loss reestablishes orientation, for instance, in time and space, as in Whitman's Flood Tide Below Me, I See You Face to Face. Poetry is compensatory, an alternative to the actual, a moral real that is superior, in Grossman's characterization. In excavating topics like these, Alan Grossman changed the way it was possible to write about poetry, as Stanley Cavell, my next example, as Toril Moy and Sean Kylan have noted, changed the way it was possible to think about philosophy. I'm recalling Cavell's attempt to connect the ordinary language philosophy of Wittgenstein and Austin to American transcendentalism, specifically to the language of everyday life as underwritten by Emerson and Thoreau's devotion to the familiar and common, but also Cavell's great essay on Emerson's redefinition of thinking as an embrace of moral perfectionism, which involves an aversion toward a present state of affairs in which one recognizes one is not yet thinking, and that what therefore is called for is self-transformation. And of course I have in mind Cavell's essay, The Avoidance of Love, a reading of King Lear, which examines the question of what acknowledgement is both in and outside the theater, a topic that has engaged Cavell throughout all of his work. Cavell has discovered forms of exegesis that are dense, ruminative, difficult, even obsessive, in the deepening pressure he puts on certain moments in literary and philosophical analysis whose boundaries he erodes, that reveal resistance to acknowledgement, as in skepticism, and which also reveal the resistance to the knowledge that value can be derived within the self, rather than always issuing from outside the line one draws to place it elsewhere. My third example is William Empson, but not the Empson of Seven Types of Ambiguity or Milton's God or the Study of Complex Words, rather the Empson whose essays on Buddhism, he lived in Japan and China in the 1930s, are collected in Argufying, where Empson wrote on the music, doctrines, and iconography of the Far East. Empson called Buddhism, quote, the other half of the truth about the world, unquote. His fascination with Buddhism as a viable alternative to the Christian sacrificial ethic of the West arises not from Buddhism's pessimism, but from the fact that Buddhist doctrine does not believe in the individual. Empson was quick to interject, quote, I naturally would not want to present myself as a believer by mistake, unquote. But he insisted that the basic position of Buddhism, which advocates impersonality, quote, needs to be remembered when one tries to survey what the human mind could think about a subject, unquote. Empson's passion for that subject is manifested in a monograph, The Asymmetry of Buddha Faces, in his provocative writing on the Buddha's fire sermon, which prefaces every edition of his collected poems, in memorable passages on the coolness of Buddhism towards heaven and toward the supernatural in general, and on Buddhism's capacity to remove all doctrinal props about immortality and still claim that death is somehow the highest value. What I find heroic is Empson's ability to write about a culture that is not his in such a way as to contemplate the foreignness of Buddhism without domesticating, assimilating, or conversely rendering it exotic. This mixture of curiosity and powerful sympathy especially vitalizes Emerson's descriptions of Buddha faces. In Emerson's allegory, the poet gives us access to a dwelling that is a home. No figure of home could domesticate the subjects explored by Grossman, Cavell, or Emerson. There is no endpoint to Grossman's thinking about the value poems confer on persons, to Cavell's, for instance, thinking about how acknowledgement makes persons real, to Emerson's defamiliarized thinking about what persons are when dissociated from individuality. No endpoint which could lead to the protective enclosure that home is presumed to be. Rather, such thinking presses against the confinement of any decisive dwelling or resting place. Just the same, or rather for that reason, their writing and enlargement is exhilarating. And in speaking about my admiration for the three figures I've meant to emphasize a certain resistance to categorical boundaries that delimit what can be thought and what can be done. As a coda, I'd like to conclude with a single sentence by Walt Whitman that epitomizes, albeit in a different register, what that resistance is. This is what you shall do. Love the earth and the sun and the animals, despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks, stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your income and labor to others, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God, have patience and indulgence toward the people, take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men, go freely with powerful uneducated persons and with the young and with the mothers of families. Read these leaves in the open air every season of every year of your life. Re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem and have the richest fluency, not only in its words, but in the silent lines of its lips and face, and between the lashes of your eyes, and in every motion and joint of your body. Thank you.